conjunctions. Creating complex sentences by joining a main clause and a subordinate clause using a subordinating conjunction. Main clauses make sense on their own. Here are some main clauses. I have a horse. You are a dancer. He went to town. If I put a capital letter at the start of each of these clauses and a full stop at the end, they would be a complete sentence, a main clause. Can you identify which of the clauses below are main clauses? Which ones make sense on their own? Although he had no money, Fred had fun at the park. Because his friends were there, Jim went to the shops. Remember, main clauses make sense on their own. Pause the video and decide which are the main clauses. Okay, so, although he had no money is not a main clause, doesn't make sense on its own. Fred had fun at the park. I can put a full stop on that, it makes complete sense. It's a main clause. Because his friends were there, that doesn't make sense on its own. Jim went to the shops. Now that makes complete sense on its own. So the main clauses here are Fred had fun at the park and Jim went to the shops. They make sense on their own. Now a complex sentence has a main clause and one or more subordinate clauses that give extra information to the main clause. So, this main clause, Fred had fun at the park, could have the subordinate clause because his friends were there to give more information about why Fred had fun at the park. This main clause, Jim went to the shops, could have the subordinate clause, although he had no money, and that gives extra information to the fact that he went to the shops even though he had no money. These sentences altogether, a main clause and a subordinate clause, are complex sentences. We could put a full stop at the end and they make sense. Subordinate clauses don't really make sense without the main clause. If we just read this part of the sentence, because his friends were there, doesn't make sense. It needs the main clause to help it to make sense. Although he had no money, doesn't make sense on its own. It needs to be with the main clause, Jim went to the shops although he had no money, to make sense altogether. Subordinating conjunctions. Subordinating conjunctions are the linking words which are used at the start of a subordinate clause. For example, Susie wore a thick coat because it was a cold day. Because is a subordinating conjunction, and this is the word that starts the subordinate clause, because it was a cold day. There are lots of other examples of subordinating conjunctions. We can use a phrase to remember more subordinating conjunctions, and the phrase that we can use is I saw a wobber. The letters in I saw a wobber remind us of them. So the I is if. S for since. A for as. W for when. Another A for although. Another W for while. Another A for after. A B for before. A U for until. And another B for because. And these are all subordinating conjunctions that we can use at the start of a subordinate clause that gives extra information to a main clause. Okay, Harriet cooked the tea before she went out. The main clause here is the part that can make sense on its own. Harriet cooked the tea. I could put a full stop here and that would make complete sense. The subordinate clause, the bit that doesn't really make sense on its own but that gives extra information to the main clause, is before she went out. This is the subordinate clause, so the subordinating conjunction is the word that is at the start of that clause, before. Harriet cooked the tea before she went out. Let's look at the next sentence. Jill went to bed late, although she was tired. Can you think which is the main clause in this sentence? Which is the part that makes complete sense on its own? Okay, and it's the first part. Jill went to bed late. I could put a full stop here and that would make sense on its own. The extra information, although she was tired, this is the subordinate clause. And at the start of it, we've got although, which is the subordinating conjunction. Okay, and let's have a look at another sentence. Paul was cross when he spilled the paint on the floor. Can you think which is the main clause here? Which is the part that makes sense on its own? And it's Paul was cross. We could put a full stop here. This is the main clause. When was he cross? He was cross when he spilled the paint on the floor. This is the subordinate clause, and the word at the start is when, which is the subordinating conjunction. Paul was cross when he spilled the paint on the floor. That part, when he spilled the paint on the floor, doesn't make sense on its own. Okay, now it's your turn. Look at this main clause and the extra information. I can't buy a toy. I get my pocket money. Can you add the extra information to the main clause using an appropriate subordinating conjunction? Choose one from I saw a wubbob. Okay, here's the list of the conjunctions that you could use. Try each word in the gap and see how they sound. More than one might make sense. Pause the video now while you have a go. Okay, let's go through them one at a time. I can't buy a toy if I get my pocket money. Well, that doesn't make sense. You probably could buy a toy if you got your pocket money. I can't buy a toy since I get my pocket money. That doesn't make sense. I can't buy a toy as I get my pocket money. No. I can't buy a toy when I get my pocket money. Well, I probably can, so that doesn't make sense. I can't buy a toy although I get my pocket money. No, that doesn't make sense. I can't buy a toy while I get my pocket money. No. I can't buy a toy after I get my pocket money. Well, I probably can, so that doesn't make sense. I can't buy a toy before I get my pocket money. Now that probably does make sense. I can't buy a toy before I get it. That makes sense. I can't buy a toy until I get my pocket money. That makes sense as well. I can't buy a toy because I get my pocket money. That doesn't make sense. So two good choices here would be before and until. Now it's your turn again. Choose a subordinating conjunction from the list to complete the sentences below. We've got I went to bed, Rosie went home. Ivan entered the cave, he was scared of the dark. Ivan danced, the fiddlers played a tune. Can you choose one of those subordinating conjunctions to start the subordinate clauses? Pause the video while you have a go. Okay, let's go through the sentences one at a time. In the first sentence, I went to bed, the word after makes the most sense. I went to bed after Rosie went home. Wouldn't make sense to go to bed before she went home if your friend is playing with you. Let's write that in. Next one. Ivan entered the cave although he was scared of the dark. Although makes the most sense here. Even though he was scared of the dark, he still went into the cave. And the last one, Ivan danced. Now, there's a couple that would make sense here. We could have Ivan danced as the fiddlers played a tune. We could have Ivan danced when the fiddlers played a tune. And we could have Ivan danced while the fiddlers played a tune. All of those would make good sense. Now, changing the position of a subordinate clause in your complex sentence will make your writing even more interesting. Here's an example with a subordinate clause at the end. Ivan would be in trouble unless help arrived. In the next example, the subordinate clause comes first. Unless help arrived, Ivan would be in trouble. When the subordinate clause comes first, it should be followed by a comma. Unless help arrived, comma, Ivan would be in trouble.